It did not happen in front of cameras. There was no emergency summit. No walkout. No angry press conference. Instead, it happened the way real power shifts usually do. Quietly. Canada declined Washington's final proposal during closed-door negotiations. The refusal was polite, procedural, almost forgettable. But inside diplomatic circles, it landed hard. Because for decades, one assumption governed the U.S.-Canada relationship. When it mattered, Canada would ultimately say yes. This time it did not. And that matters not because of the offer itself, but because of what the refusal revealed about how power is now exercised between allies who were once assumed to be locked into hierarchy. Stay with this because the context behind this decision completely changes how it should be understood. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. According to long-standing reporting on U.S.-Canada relations by outlets like Reuters and the Associated Press, negotiations between the two governments typically operate within established institutional frameworks. These frameworks have evolved over decades, shaped by geographic proximity, economic interdependence, and shared security concerns that make the U.S.-Canada relationship one of the most consequential bilateral partnerships in the Western Hemisphere. The two nations share the longest undefended border in the world, and their economies are so deeply intertwined that disruptions in one country ripple almost immediately into the other. Trade is governed by agreements such as NAFTA and later the USMCA. These agreements did not emerge overnight. They represent years of painstaking negotiation, sector-by-sector compromise, and political capital spent on both sides of the border. NAFTA, implemented in 1994, fundamentally restructured North American commerce, creating integrated supply chains that span all three member nations. When that agreement was renegotiated and replaced by the USMCA in 2020, it preserved much of that integration while updating provisions on labor, digital trade, and automotive manufacturing. The existence of these formal structures means that trade disputes, however contentious, typically follow predictable pathways toward resolution. Defense cooperation is structured through NORAD. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, established in 1958, represents one of the most enduring examples of binational military integration anywhere in the world. Canadian and American personnel work side by side monitoring continental airspace, and this cooperation continues regardless of which parties hold power in Ottawa or Washington. NORAD exemplifies how institutional architecture can depoliticize certain aspects of the bilateral relationship, insulating critical functions from the friction that inevitably arises between sovereign nations. Diplomatic disputes are usually resolved through incremental compromise. This pattern has held through administrations of every ideological stripe. When tensions emerge over softwood lumber, dairy access, or environmental regulations, the expectation on both sides has traditionally been that skilled diplomats will eventually find middle ground. Neither government has historically sought to humiliate the other publicly, and both have understood that the relationship is too important to sacrifice for short-term political gains. In this case, that pattern broke. Canadian officials declined a U.S. proposal that Washington believed was the end of the negotiating line. The American side had apparently concluded that their offer represented a reasonable final position, one that Canadian counterparts would accept, even if reluctantly. This expectation reflected decades of experience in which Canada, as the smaller economic partner, ultimately accommodated American preferences when pushed to the final stage of negotiations. There was no public escalation. No retaliation announced. The refusal came quietly, through diplomatic channels, without the theatrical press conferences or social media provocations that have characterized other international disputes in recent years. But internally, Canadian policymakers treated the refusal as a deliberate assertion of national position, not a tactical delay. This distinction matters enormously. A tactical delay suggests that Canada was simply buying time, waiting for better conditions or a more favorable American administration. An assertion of national position, by contrast, signals something more fundamental, a decision that certain Canadian interests cannot be traded away regardless of the pressure applied. As reported in multiple policy analyses over recent years, Canada has increasingly signaled discomfort with automatic alignment on trade, environmental policy, and regulatory standards. Analysts have noted growing frustration in Ottawa with the assumption that Canada will follow wherever the United States leads. This frustration spans the political spectrum and reflects not anti-Americanism but rather a maturing sense that Canadian interests, while often parallel to American interests, are not identical to them. Climate policy has been one flashpoint, pharmaceutical pricing another, data privacy and digital sovereignty a third. In each case, Canadian policymakers have begun asking whether alignment serves Canadian citizens or merely American corporations and political priorities. This rejection followed that trajectory. It was not a sudden rupture. It was a decision that reflected years of institutional recalibration. The groundwork had been laid through countless internal debates, revised policy frameworks, and a generational shift in how Canadian officials understand their country's place in North America. What appeared to American observers as an unexpected refusal was, from the Canadian perspective, the logical conclusion of a process that had been underway for years. If you've seen similar moments where a quiet decision had outsized consequences, say so in the comments. The issue was not diplomatic etiquette. Diplomatic etiquette concerns itself with protocol, with the proper forms of address, with who speaks first and who signs where. These are the surface rituals of international relations, important in their own way but ultimately decorative. Nations do not rupture relationships over misplaced salutations or improperly formatted communiques. The friction that emerged between Washington and Ottawa operated at a far deeper level, touching questions of sovereignty, agency, and the fundamental nature of alliance itself. The issue was expectation. In professional diplomatic practice, especially between asymmetric partners, influence relies on predictability. The larger partner, in this case the United States, develops mental models of how the smaller partner will behave under various conditions. These models are not written down in formal documents. They exist as institutional assumptions, passed from one generation of diplomats and policymakers to the next. Over decades of successful negotiations, American officials had internalized a particular understanding of Canadian behavior. That Ottawa would resist initially, negotiate vigorously, extract concessions where possible, but ultimately accept American terms when the alternative was prolonged confrontation. This understanding had proven accurate often enough that it hardened into something resembling certainty. Washington operated on the assumption that leverage alone would close the deal. The logic seemed unassailable. The United States possesses an economy roughly 10 times larger than Canada's. American consumers represent the destination for approximately 3/4 of Canadian exports. American security guarantees underpin Canadian defense planning. American cultural products dominate Canadian media landscapes. American financial institutions hold substantial interests in Canadian markets. From a pure power politics perspective, these asymmetries should translate into negotiating advantages so decisive that Canadian resistance becomes, at most, a brief delay before inevitable accommodation. That assumption failed. What crossed the line was not defiance but independence. This distinction carries enormous weight. Defiance implies emotional reaction, a rejection rooted in pride or resentment rather than calculation. Independence, by contrast, suggests rational assessment, a considered judgment that Canadian interests require a different path, regardless of American preferences. Canadian officials were not thumbing their noses at Washington. They were not seeking to embarrass their American counterparts or to score points in domestic politics. They were simply exercising the sovereign authority that every nation possesses but that weaker partners rarely deploy against stronger ones. From an institutional standpoint, Canada exercised discretion that Washington had come to view as theoretical rather than real. This is perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire episode. American policymakers understood, in an abstract sense, that Canada possessed the legal and constitutional authority to reject proposals that conflicted with Canadian interests. This authority appears in treaties, in international law, in the very structure of the bilateral relationship. But understanding something theoretically differs profoundly from expecting it practically. Washington had grown accustomed to Canadian flexibility, and that habit of mind had transformed into an assumption of Canadian compliance. The distinction between can refuse and will refuse had collapsed in American strategic thinking. Legal scholars and foreign policy analysts have long noted that alliances are not contracts of obedience. They are frameworks of mutual consent. This principle appears throughout the academic literature on international relations. Alliances endure not because one party commands and the other obeys, but because both parties perceive continuing benefit from cooperation. The moment that perception shifts, the moment one partner concludes that the alliance serves only the other's interests, the foundation begins to erode. Scholars have documented this dynamic in contexts ranging from NATO burden-sharing disputes to security arrangements in East Asia. The theoretical framework existed. What was lacking was American attention to its practical implications. This moment exposed how far U.S. policymakers had drifted from that reality. Somewhere along the way, in the accumulation of successful negotiations and favorable outcomes, American officials had begun treating Canadian cooperation as a fixed feature of the international landscape rather than as a continuously renewed choice. This drift happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, through countless small interactions that reinforced the assumption without ever testing it. The Canadian refusal did not create a new reality, it revealed an existing one that Washington had failed to perceive. The implications extend well beyond this single negotiation. If American policymakers misread Canadian intentions so fundamentally, similar miscalculations may be occurring with other partners, nations that appear compliant but are quietly reassessing the costs and benefits of alignment. The Canadian case may be less an anomaly than a leading indicator of broader shifts in how middle powers relate to American hegemony. If rules and standards matter regardless of which country holds more power, tap-like. This was not an isolated event. Isolated events can be explained away through circumstance, attributed to the personalities involved, or dismissed as tactical maneuvers that signify nothing deeper. They arrive without antecedent and leave without consequence. The Canadian refusal possessed none of these characteristics. It emerged from a context, fit within a sequence, and pointed toward a direction. To understand what happened requires looking backward across years of accumulating signals that, in retrospect, told a coherent story. Over the past decade, Canada has taken more assertive positions on several fronts that collectively reveal a strategic reorientation in Ottawa's approach to continental and global affairs. Trade diversification beyond the U.S. For generations, Canadian economic policy operated on the assumption that American markets were not merely important but irreplaceable. This assumption shaped infrastructure investments, regulatory frameworks, and the mental models of Canadian business leaders. The sheer gravitational pull of the American economy seemed to render alternatives impractical. Yet Canadian policymakers have increasingly pursued trade agreements with the European Union, with Pacific Rim nations through the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and with emerging markets that previous generations of Canadian diplomats largely ignored. These agreements required substantial political capital to negotiate and implement. They demanded that Canadian industries adapt to new standards and new competitors. No government undertakes such efforts casually. The diversification push reflects a calculated judgment that dependence on a single market, however large and proximate, creates vulnerabilities that prudent statecraft must address. Climate commitments that conflict with U.S. energy priorities. Canada possesses enormous fossil fuel reserves, particularly in the oil sands of Alberta, and the extraction industries that exploit these reserves have historically aligned Canadian energy policy with American consumption patterns. Yet Ottawa has moved toward climate targets and regulatory frameworks that create friction with American energy priorities, particularly during periods when Washington has retreated from international climate commitments. This divergence carries real economic costs. It generates domestic political conflict between resource-producing provinces and federal authorities. It complicates cross-border pipeline projects and energy infrastructure planning. Canadian leaders have accepted these costs because they have concluded that long-term Canadian interests, environmental, economic, and reputational, require a different trajectory than the one American policy has followed. Multilateral agreements Washington has stepped back from. When the United States withdrew from or declined to join international frameworks on trade, climate, and global governance, Canada faced a choice. Ottawa could follow Washington's lead, maintaining alignment at the cost of international credibility, or it could remain engaged with multilateral institutions even when doing so meant visible divergence from American positions. Canada repeatedly chose the latter path. This choice was not automatic or costless. It required Canadian diplomats to navigate awkward conversations with American counterparts and demanded that Canadian officials invest resources in institutions that Washington had deprioritized. The pattern of continued multilateral engagement, sustained across different Canadian governments, suggests a bipartisan consensus that Canada's interests are served by international rules and institutions even when the United States questions their value. Each instance on its own looked manageable. American officials could interpret each Canadian decision as a response to particular circumstances, domestic political pressures, provincial interests, the idiosyncrasies of specific negotiations. This interpretation allowed Washington to avoid confronting the possibility that something more fundamental was shifting. If each event was merely tactical, then the underlying relationship remained sound. If each event was idiosyncratic, then no strategic response was necessary. This fragmented perception served psychological and bureaucratic purposes, but it obscured the larger pattern taking shape. Together they form a pattern, not of hostility. Canadian officials continue to express genuine appreciation for American partnership. Security cooperation remains robust. Cultural and personal ties between the two nations grow denser with each passing year. Canadian and American citizens cross the shared border for work, family, and leisure in numbers that dwarf most international boundaries. Nothing in Canadian behavior suggests a desire for confrontation or a rejection of the bilateral relationship's fundamental importance. Of recalibration. The better framework for understanding Canadian behavior is adjustment rather than rupture. Ottawa is not walking away from its relationship with Washington. It is renegotiating the terms of engagement, asserting interests that it previously subordinated, and building alternatives that reduce the costs of future disagreements. This recalibration proceeds incrementally, without dramatic announcements or theatrical gestures, which is precisely why American observers have found it easy to miss. Political scientists have documented similar behavior among middle powers responding to a more fragmented global order. The post-Cold War assumption of American unipolarity has given way to a more complex landscape in which multiple centers of economic and political power compete for influence. Middle powers, nations large enough to possess meaningful capabilities but not large enough to shape the international system unilaterally, face new strategic calculations in this environment. Scholars have observed middle powers hedging their relationships with great powers, diversifying partnerships, and investing in regional institutions that provide alternatives to great power dominance. Canada fits this pattern precisely. Canada is not abandoning alliances. It is redefining the terms under which it participates. This redefinition does not require dramatic gestures or public confrontations. It proceeds through countless small decisions. A trade agreement here, a climate commitment there, a quiet refusal when American expectations exceed Canadian tolerance. The cumulative effect of these decisions reshapes the relationship gradually, almost imperceptibly, until a moment arrives when the gap between American assumptions and Canadian reality becomes impossible to ignore. If you see a broader pattern here or think this was a one-off, share your view. There was no immediate retaliation. In an era when international disputes frequently escalate through social media salvos and televised denunciations, the American response to Canadian refusal was notable for what it lacked. No tariffs were announced within hours of the rejection. No ambassadors were recalled for consultations. No presidential statements condemned Canadian ingratitude or threatened consequences. The machinery of American power, so capable of generating dramatic responses when politically useful, remained largely still. This silence was itself a form of communication, though its meaning remained ambiguous. Was Washington exercising restraint, calculating its next move, or simply uncertain how to respond to a scenario its institutional assumptions had not anticipated? Markets did not panic. Financial analysts monitoring cross-border trade flows, currency movements, and equity valuations in sectors dependent on U.S. Canada commerce detected no significant disruption. The Canadian dollar held steady against its American counterpart. Supply chains continued to function. Investors did not flee Canadian assets or demand risk premiums for exposure to bilateral trade. This market stability reflected the deep structural integration between the two economies, integration so extensive that even significant diplomatic friction could not immediately unwind it. But market stability also reflected something else, a judgment by financial actors that this dispute, however meaningful diplomatically, would not fundamentally alter the commercial relationship that both nations depended upon. Trade did not collapse. Trucks continued crossing at Windsor and Buffalo and Blaine. Container ships moved through shared waterways. Agricultural products flowed in both directions. The bureaucratic infrastructure governing customs, inspections, and regulatory compliance operated without interruption. For the millions of workers whose livelihoods depended on cross-border commerce, the diplomatic dispute registered as noise rather than signal, something happening in distant capitals that bore no immediate relevance to their daily routines. This continuity demonstrated both the resilience of institutional frameworks and their capacity to insulate economic activity from political turbulence. Military cooperation did not stop. NORAD continued its mission of continental aerospace monitoring. Intelligence sharing arrangements remained intact. Joint training exercises proceeded according to schedule. Defense planners on both sides continued coordinating on threats that respected no borders: cyber intrusions, potential terrorist operations, the long-term challenge of Arctic security in an era of climate change. The defense relationship had been deliberately structured to withstand political friction, and that structure held. Whatever tensions existed between Ottawa and Washington, both governments understood that security cooperation served interests too fundamental to sacrifice for advantage in other domains. But the consequences were institutional, not theatrical. The absence of visible drama obscured significant activity occurring within the bureaucratic depths of both governments. Agencies reviewed their assumptions. Analysts prepared assessments. Policymakers requested briefings on questions they had not previously thought to ask. The Canadian refusal had not changed the world, but it had changed how certain officials understood the world, and in the long run, that shift in understanding might prove more consequential than any immediate retaliation could have been. Inside Washington, agencies initiated internal reviews of assumptions governing North American policy. These reviews unfolded far from public view, in memoranda circulated among mid-level officials and meetings convened in windowless conference rooms. The questions under examination were foundational rather than tactical. How had American policymakers come to assume Canadian compliance so completely? What other assumptions governing Allied relationships might prove similarly unfounded? Were existing frameworks for understanding Canadian interests adequate, or had those frameworks calcified around outdated understandings? According to reporting on diplomatic responses and similar disputes, this is typically how credibility shocks register at the bureaucratic level. The immediate aftermath appears calm because the real processing occurs internally, through institutional mechanisms designed to learn from unexpected outcomes. The larger risk for the U.S. was reputational. Reputation in international relations functions as a form of capital, accumulated through consistent behavior over time, deployed to shape the expectations of other actors, and difficult to rebuild once damaged. American influence has always rested partly on the perception that Washington possessed not merely power but the will to use it effectively. Allies cooperated because they believed American commitments were reliable. Adversaries exercised caution because they believed American threats were credible. This perception depended on countless observations of American behavior across decades of diplomacy. Each instance in which American expectations were met reinforced the perception. Each instance in which they were defied potentially undermined it. Other allies were watching. Diplomats in Tokyo, Seoul, Canberra, and European capitals monitored the U.S. Canada dispute with professional interest. They noted the Canadian refusal. They noted the American response, or lack thereof. They filed reports to their own governments analyzing what the episode revealed about American leverage and American resolve. These observers were not hostile to American interests. Many represented nations whose security depended on American commitments. But they were engaged in continuous assessment of the international environment, and the Canadian case provided new data for their models. If Canada could decline without immediate penalty, others might conclude that U.S. leverage was more conditional than previously believed. This conclusion would not necessarily lead Allied nations to defect from American-led arrangements. But it might encourage them to drive harder bargains, to resist American preferences more frequently, to explore alternatives they had previously dismissed as impractical. The marginal shift in Allied behavior across dozens of relationships and hundreds of negotiations could cumulatively reshape American influence in ways that no single dramatic confrontation ever would. For Canada, the risk was different. Canadian policymakers harbored no illusions about their country's position in the continental hierarchy. The asymmetries of power that American officials had relied upon were real, and no amount of diplomatic assertiveness could wish them away. Canada's prosperity depended on access to American markets. Canada's security depended on American defense commitments. Canada's influence in international forums depended partly on its relationship with the world's most powerful nation. Its leadership understood that autonomy does not eliminate dependence. This understanding informed every aspect of Canadian strategy. Ottawa was not attempting to escape its geographic and economic circumstances. It was attempting to navigate them more skillfully. The goal was not independence from American influence, an impossibility given continental realities, but rather a recalibration of the terms on which that influence operated. Canadian officials sought to demonstrate that cooperation was a choice rather than an inevitability, that Ottawa retained meaningful discretion even within an asymmetric relationship. The U.S. remains its largest trading partner and closest security ally. These facts had not changed and would not change regardless of how the current dispute resolved. Canadian and American interests remained deeply intertwined. The question was not whether the relationship would continue but on what basis it would proceed. Canadian assertiveness was a bid for different terms, not a rejection of the relationship itself. The refusal was not an exit. It was a negotiation reset. Canadian officials understood that their refusal had not ended the conversation but transformed it. By demonstrating willingness to decline American proposals, Ottawa had established that future negotiations would need to account for Canadian interests more seriously. The short-term cost of friction might yield long-term benefits if it produced a more balanced and sustainable relationship. This calculation involved risk, the risk that Washington might respond with sustained pressure rather than accommodation. But Canadian leaders had judged that risk acceptable. Stay with this because the broader implications go well beyond this single decision. What happened between Washington and Ottawa illuminates dynamics operating throughout the international system. The assumptions that failed in this case, assumptions about leverage, compliance, and the nature of alliance, are not unique to North American relations. They shape how great powers understand their relationships with smaller partners around the world. The Canadian case offers a window into what happens when those assumptions collide with the enduring reality of sovereign agency. This moment was not about defiance. It was about limits. The post-World War II assumption that proximity guarantees compliance no longer holds. Not with adversaries. Not even with allies. Institutions endure when they adapt. They fail when they rely on habit instead of consent. Canada's decision did not end U.S. influence. It clarified its boundaries. For Washington, the lesson is uncomfortable but necessary. Authority that is assumed eventually erodes. Authority that is negotiated endures. And for every country watching, the message was simple. Even the closest relationships still require respect. If you value calm, fact-driven analysis that explains what headlines leave out, subscribe here. That's what this channel does.